One of the interesting things about doing infinite scroll is, the idea was very simple. It's that I could use knowledge about the human mind, how it works, to make an interface that I thought was better. And that is, we all have, sets of things which are true about us because we live inside of this meat suit, and we can't control those things. So, our bodies, we can only run so fast and jump so high. And with our minds, right, we can only pay attention to so many things. We only stop to let our brain catch up with our impulse when we get things called stopping cues. So when you're drinking a glass of wine, you generally don't stop until you reach the end of your glass of wine, and then you're like, oh, should I have another one? If your glass just kept refilling, you wouldn't stop. So that was some of the reason why I was interested in infinite scroll. I'm like, you're already telling the computer, go back, show me more, I haven't found the right thing. So every time as a designer you ask a user to answer a question that they don't care about, you failed. But here is the unintended consequence. This, is a great interface for an individual user, but it ended up wasting hundreds of millions of human hours. And now that code can reach scales so quickly, so telephone took 75 years for telephones to reach 100 million users. It took Facebook 4 years to reach 100 million users. Instagram, 2 years to reach 100 million users. Candy Crush, less than 1 year. Every piece of code we write that reaches scale is inherently political. And actually, I take a little bit of issue with the idea of unintended consequences, even as the name. When you write code, and code, as Lessig likes to say, is law. It's stronger than law. Law, you get to choose whether you follow it or not. Code, you are in that little bucket. We don't get to hide behind having our consequences even be called unintended. They're just consequences. So if you want to understand where we are as a human race and where we're going, I think it's useful to ask how we define ourselves. How do we define ourselves? We define ourselves as Homo Sapiens Sapiens. That is, Homo, man, sapiens, wise. But we're not just Homo sapiens. We're very proud of ourselves. So we're Homo Sapiens Sapiens. We're the wise man who understands his own wisdom. In fact, almost all of our most interesting academic studies are about us pointing our intelligence back at ourselves, right? So obviously social sciences and psychology, but if you think about it, history began when we started to record information about ourselves and pass it on. Philosophy is about knowing how we know. Neuroscience is our brains understanding our brains. We are fundamentally Homo Sapiens Sapiens. So zoom out for a second. What could we say about any intelligent species living anywhere in the universe on any planet? There's not a lot we could say. But one thing we could say is this. Any species that's sufficiently intelligent will at some point take the telescope of its own intelligence, point it back at itself, and say, how do we work? Why do we believe what we believe? And once they've reverse engineered themselves, what happens? What happens when the technology that they build starts to understand them as good or better than they understand themselves? Well, there's a term for these kinds of systems where you can metaphorically open up the skull of this hypothetical creature, and it can start fucking with itself. When the input of or the output of a system gets put back into the input of a system, this is called a dynamic system, the area of study that this leads to is called chaos. You can't predict what happens. It's these feed-forward systems. And so, you guys heard of Fermi's paradox? Essentially that given the hundreds of billions of stars, even just in our own galaxy, and you multiply that by the probability that there could be other life, and even if that's 0.0000001, given that you can traverse our particular galaxy in a couple million years, we should have seen life by now, but we haven't. Why? Well, maybe this is a kind of singularity, a self-singularity, more fundamental than the AI one, the Kurzweilian one, that none of these species can get beyond. And isn't it interesting that we as humans, right now, are crossing this threshold? We heard about CRISPR, where we're starting to reverse engineer how we work physically. And psycho-emotionally, I mean, that's exactly what Cambridge Analytica was. Like, really early on, but there we go. There was a study out of Japan late last year that said we could reconstruct what you were seeing visually from brain scans, fMRI data. We know that when you dream, your visual cortex is activated in the same way as if you are seeing. So what does that mean? That means, in the next 5 years, we're going to start to be able to read out dreams, which is sort of exciting and also terrifying. 2015, there's a paper that showed that you can read people's micro-expressions with computers better than humans can. So these are the true signals about how you feel that you can't control. What did the iPhone 10 or X, whatever you call it, what did it release? It gave the ability to read your face in real time, in 3D, right? There's an API. Right now, Netflix, Facebook, they're all based on engagement business models, right? Their business model is to crawl down our brainstorms and brainstems and frack us for our attention. And to get better and better at that, right now, the only engagement they have is like what we look at, how long, and what we click on. Wouldn't they love to know the exact moment that you got bored, when you looked away, when you got a little self-satisfied, smug smile? And then what happens when that data is societal scaled up and used to target you for the next political ad? Or when Google Duplex is used to scale up, and instead of just calling to make haircuts, it can now use, just like the Trump campaign did, 66,000 different scripts, all based on AI. So you now have a 100,000 person equivalent call center making calls across the US to try to persuade you to vote for a particular candidate with the exact right messaging targeted for you in the voice that sounds a little bit like your dad, because you can do that now with even with Lyra Voice or Adobe Voco. Or when ads are like, cool, we can target you because we can make a face that you can't help but trust just by taking an average of all of your friends' faces on Facebook. So the big change that needs to happen is that we as human beings are limited systems, right? We just have some fundamental truths, which is why infinite scroll works on every single one of us. And unless we move from a kind of human-centered design to a human protective design, from human-computer interaction to technology-society interaction, our final right, which is sort of the privacy to our thoughts and to the sovereignty of how we make decisions, will be continually under siege. And here's the thing, right? When Garry Kasparov plays against, or when we play against Garry Kasparov in chess, we would lose. Why? Because he can think so many moves ahead. When Garry Kasparov plays against, Deep Blue or any of the new systems, he always loses. Why? Because the AI thinks so many moves ahead. So what happens when you take the smartest supercomputers, the biggest supercomputers in the world, arm it with the most intimate data about us, and point it at our heads? So those are the consequences we need to think about as we design our systems. Otherwise, everything we see now, where YouTube is radicalizing us, right? If you start people on any YouTube video, within a couple video plays, you end up in a conspiracy video. So, if you start, this is true, you start somebody on like a teenage girl on some sort of dieting thing, you end up in anorexia. Start somebody like a news article or news video for 9/11, you end up within 3 video plays on conspiracy videos. On a physics video, you end up within 3 video plays on flat Earth. And if you think about it, right, if even only one person out of 1,000 starts to believe these things, well, at the scale of YouTube, which has as many people that watch YouTube as there are people that follow Islam, that prints out Scientology-sized cults every day. So, I see my time is up. You're welcome. Make you all, before I got to the solution section. But seriously, right, when we are at this scale, we cannot afford even calling them unintended consequences. That gives us too much leeway to just pretend like we need to build. We'll get blinded, as we always have, by the goodness of the things that we create. We'll call out specific examples of like, oh, look how awesome this one example is, and ignore the systematic tilt that we're doing to society. So, thank you.